So if you ask any kid of the 1980s of a very popular software house for microcomputers, in particular Ocean Software will likely come to mind. So if you're familiar with Ocean Software, they were a publisher based in Manchester and they were pretty much the dominant force of the 80s microcomputer scene. So in with that mix of games that they released, and they released a hell of a lot of games, we had a lot of trash. So today's video is going to be showing you the very worst published by Ocean Software. Check this one out. First up on my list of the top 10 worst Ocean Software games is Double Dragon, and yes, this one came out in the 80s by Melbourne House. A couple years later, Ocean actually felt sorry for what a bad port it was, so Ocean went ahead and created his own version back in 1991. And so this was a little bit more of an improvement, but as you can see, the sprites are really blocky and the collision detection is extremely bad. The only really good feature about this version of Double Dragon is the actual presentation of it. The music is pretty good, and at least you can see the sprites without having a line through the middle of them. So all in all, Double Dragon 1991 by Ocean is a fairly bad game, and if you've not tried it and you've not heard of it, it's not really surprising. It's not a really out there game. In 9th place we have Shadow Warriors. This one's also known as Ninja Gaiden. This one was released in 1990. I actually owned this one as a child and it was a massive disappointment. So as you can see with the colours on screen in the gameplay, the colours look really washed out. The actual sprite for the character you play yourself is actually fairly good, but the enemies look like something from some bizarre cartoon where the animation is really poor. Collision detection is off, and the gameplay itself is just so poor. I wouldn't even qualify this game as a beat 'em up. In 8th place, we've got Barmy Builders. Now, this is just a very bad game. So this one was actually an early title from Ocean Software, actually released in 1984. And it's just pretty much an Atari 2600 game. So as we know, early Commodore 64 games were very basic, but I think Barmy Builders actually took that a step too far. A very boring, uninspired game, and I highly don't recommend this one. Next up we got It's a Knockout. Now this one was released in 1985 and the only very good feature about this game is that the musician was Fred Gray, who obviously went on to do many good soundtracks for Commodore 64 games. It's a Knockout was obviously from the game show, and Ocean did its best to mess this up like it did normally with most of its licenses. It's a Knockout is a very dull game where you're continuously catching things and it's not responsive, it's just absolutely terrible. As we know, Ocean Software was no complete stranger to porting very popular arcade games onto the Commodore 64 amongst others. This is definitely how not to do it. This game was very slow for its time. Even in 1989 standards, the colours was really dull and the gameplay was really abysmal. It's a very poor, shocking port of an arcade classic. Thankfully, we did get a sequel to this, Chase HQ 2, so if you've not checked the second one out, check that out. It's very good compared to this pile of trash. So as we know at this point, Ocean Software had lots of licenses for very popular franchises of the 1980s and even early 1990s. So Miami Vice was no exception. Obviously this is a very popular show in the 1980s, a little bit before my time, but I loved the theme tune, Crockett's theme, excellent stuff. This game, however, is just very awful. The whole game revolves around driving your car around Miami, but the very slightest little touch or little scratch on your car makes your car blow up. And there's plenty of buildings to explore, but not many people to see, so Miami Vice just goes down. It's a complete load of turd. Avoid this one. Next up, one of the most popular action stars of the 80s, this is Arnold Schwarzenegger's Red Heat. And Ocean Software did it again. They took a fairly popular film at the time and turned it into a very dull affair. So what you see in the gameplay footage is pretty much the entire game. So Arnold Schwarzenegger's abilities are headbutting enemies. Obviously the first stage of this is from the first part of the film, the shower scene. And this is literally everything you get in this game. Headbutting, punching, and people throwing things at you. It's the most boring beat 'em up I've ever played, and I'm really not sure if this should even go down as a beat 'em up. So the 1980s was definitely a decade of iconic vehicles, and Knight Rider's kit was no exception. So as a kid, me and my brother would watch Knight Rider, even have annuals. But the game itself is complete trash. Now, you're riding around with kit, and there are several different sections of this game. But the stages in particular, which I'm playing here, this is actually driving around with kit. Now, rather than sounding anything like kit in the show, it sounds a little bit like a lawnmower breaking down. It's a very bad game, and it almost feels very uncontrollable. And finally, we've actually arrived at something half decent. This is Top Gun. Obviously, Top Gun star Tom Cruise in one of the 1980s biggest selling films. I'd like to say this was true. Obviously, Top Gun was a massive hit in the day with a breakout song for Berlin with Take My Breath Away. But the game was just absolutely terrible. Now, I'll be honest with you, playing this game for this video, I had no idea what the hell was going on. You got green vector graphics, and it appears that my game panel was on the left hand side. I've no idea what to do with this game, and it just seems terrible, and it seems to me that most of the Commodore community can't stand it either. This is a very, very bad game. And finally, in first place, we have got Highlander. Now, this one was released in 1986. And as you can see from the gameplay footage, for 1986, these sprites are just so chunky, blocky, and it doesn't even feel like you're playing a game. So obviously, this is another big film of the 1980s. And again, as I was saying throughout this video, Ocean Software had a tendency of taking very big names of the day and completely messing it up. Now, personally, if I had this game in the 80s, I would have been crying at Christmas.